All right, let's get this underway. All right, so my name is Leo Sukiyo. Welcome to Legal Leo. So I'm going to talk about topics that I feel are relevant in League of Legends. And first topic that we're going to be starting off with is variables in assessing team strengths. Now, in the midst of the pre-spring split power rankings, my mind was forced to think about the metrics by which some of these analysts and just known figures in the esports community were power ranking teams, whether they be in NA, EU, etc. And I needed to understand how they measured the potential performance of a team. I wanted to know by what metrics each individual, whether they be a journalist or an analyst, how they ranked these teams and by which metrics would be most important, because the different people, different metrics would stand out. Two people may consider team synergy, but one might value another aspect over that. And so I wanted to just highlight or emphasize what I think the core considerations must be when looking at the metrics to judge these teams in a preseason context, and just emphasize those and highlight how many variables there actually are when you're trying to assess where the power level of a team is coming into the split. So we'll start off with the most obvious: meta. It intertwines greatly with player types, which I'll get into in a little bit, but the meta is a very influential thing. Depending on what champions are actually relevant and powerful, different teams might be able to thrive and succeed. We can consider someone like a CLG in North America and their performance throughout 2016. They went to MSI, they made it to the finals versus SKT, and they did really well. Stixxay obviously made a name for himself on the Caitlyn. Another comfort pick of his was the Ezreal at some points when Caitlyn was not available. And now you compare it to the start of spring of 2017, where it was the lethality ADCs, and their performance suffered. Now, admittedly, there were different aspects of the gameplay. Also, the top lane meta changed a little bit over time. There seemed to be more diverse picks in the top lane up until recently, where everybody seems to be picking Nautilus. That aside, the meta started changing halfway through, and it didn't favor lethality ADCs as heavily. So now you got to see Stixxay come back to these comfort ADCs. You got to see a style that wasn't just these bursty supports. You didn't just get the Zyra or just the Karma in response to that, or the Malzahar in response to anything. Obviously, these things are still potent and powerful, but there was a little more forgiveness. You could play Lulu now. You could play Karma a little more often. And so now you see CLG did much better in the second half of the spring split. So something like the meta is, I think, a catalyst in terms of who can succeed and who might not succeed. And as we follow the shift in the meta, obviously there could be other reasons. Over the course of a split, synergy can increase. Over the course of the split, individual mechanics can be analyzed, and you could see where as a player you might fail individually and then pick it up. So maybe Darshan picked up his play, X Smithy picked up his. I didn't look at the stats to great detail, so I'm not here to make a case for that. But I'm saying as the meta shifted and you have these ADCs that are more towards something like Stixxay's meta, this obviously is a factor in how CLG played towards the end of the spring split and why they have a better record in the second half of it. The next factor would be communication and language barriers. This intertwines with team synergy for obvious reasons. The better you could communicate, the more you could be on the same page. But not to get into team synergy just yet, we will get into that briefly, but communication and language barriers, the ability to communicate directly and effectively through concise information or shot calling, this is what fortifies your response time. This is what makes the team get on the same page. This is what makes everyone follow a call consistently. If you don't have that, it can disrupt the overall unity when it comes to decision making. If four people are on the same page and they want to contest the Baron and the other person doesn't feel quite like it, or the other person is too aggro and just goes in immediately over the wall, but nobody else on their team has the ability to follow them in that capacity, then it becomes dangerous and it makes the play splintered, and obviously it can hinder a team that might otherwise find some success in that Baron contest, in that Dragon contest, or just generally in a team fight. If you're able to communicate efficiently which target you want to go in on, and I think it's a little self-explanatory from there. We could see a prime example of this, I think, was Dignitas. At the beginning of the split, they had a very weak showing. I believe at some point they were 1-6 or maybe 2-6. It could have been both, technically, but they improved over time. It wasn't so efficient having Keen as the translator between Lodnik Special and Someday and Chaser. However, we did get to see this improvement over the course of the split. Naturally, you would assume if the staff is aware of a communication issue, they would bring more infrastructure on board in order to cover that up. And there had been interviews where it was pointed out that Someday and Chaser were trying to learn some English. They were getting good at it, learning it quickly. And you don't need to know too much or dreadfully much at all to communicate in-game. It's not that difficult to communicate in the game. Obviously, in interviews, that's a different issue, but we're talking about in-game performance here, so that's just an irrelevant portion of the topic. So, moving on to team synergy, and I'm kind of lumping in shot calling with this and communication. Obviously, in order to shot call, you need to be able to communicate efficiently, usually concisely. That's the best part of it. You want to be brief, direct, to the point. Everyone must understand what you're doing. And why are these things intertwined with team synergy, including communication? Because if everyone's on the same page, they can follow the same play. But additionally, team synergy doesn't only hinge upon communication, right? We can look at a team, see how much practice time they might have had before coming into the spring split, for instance, and then kind of get a gauge on whether or not they should perform well. For instance, a lot of people put CLG perhaps middle upper pack. I saw them, a lot of people ranking them in about third or fourth in the preseason, whether it be analysts or journalists. Who exactly, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was a lot of third and fourth for CLG because you figure they have the same roster. They're coming in with the same people, which means they have the same inner synergy. Now, admittedly, there were other issues with CLG, but yes, they had the same roster, so it's a reasonable assumption to say, hey, they're going to come in, they're going to perform relatively well, specifically in team fight-oriented comps, you would think, because the synergy is there. And as we learned, it wasn't, but this is hindsight now. But going into it, I think that was a reasonable assumption. It's an excellent metric to use. But when you look at newer rosters, then you would question team synergy a bit, depending on the length of time they've had to scrim or practice against other teams. Greater team synergy between players obviously would make the odds of like 2v2 outplays or outright 5v5 team fights much better in the favor of the team who has the increased synergy, the more time spent together, the ability to communicate. And we can see things like this in terms of shot calling, how concise or direct. You look at like FlyQuest High or KT Mata, people who are renowned for their shot calling, and they have their victories that can seem outright oppressive. In fact, KT more so than FlyQuest for obvious reasons. Still not going to forget the first series KT played against Samsung Galaxy. That was a slaughterhouse, absolutely a slaughterhouse. But you look at FlyQuest, and they fizzled out towards the second half of their split. KT as well, but not to the same extent. But you look at their shot calling, their strategy, and there's greater unity when these teams perform at their prime. And we get to see that, all because of the shot calling of these, what we'd like to call masterminds of the game, at least, because they definitely understand the meta to a greater degree than most people do and adapt to it at a faster frequency than many others might. Team synergy can obviously help out intricate details such as, like CC layering or target focus, and it becomes second nature via practice, which is why I'm not saying it's only communication and shot calling, but the practice the practice might be essential in order to fortify these skills. Moving on to the next point would be infrastructure. So you think about support staff. I think the most obvious case would be if we look at Echo Fox, and we saw the interview with Keith, and he was having a tough time taking community criticism. Now, this is a problem because it impacted his performance, and it shifts his focus. He's unable to just focus on self-improvement because he's too concerned about what the community is saying. Now, if he himself can't handle this, somehow resolve it within himself, then it's up to the team to figure out, hey, let's get some staff on board. Let's get a sports psychologist. And we can make this contrast between Rockhat, who at the end of their split, or towards the end of it, but a little after the halfway point, they got a sports psychologist and then proceeded to win 6 straight series against the first and second best teams in their group, which would be Misfits and G2 respectively. So you see such a large transition like that, and then you look at Echo Fox, and they had the dominance of Acadian in the early part of the split, Froggen, who was a consistent mid laner across all metrics. Even if you look on Oracle's Elixir, you could see that, keeping up with the likes of Bjergsen and Froggen in terms of things like damage. He had a little less gold than the both of them, but he carried a lot of weight in Echo Fox. But now if you have a sports psychiatrist or psychologist, and they come in and they're able to work on the mental issues that these players are facing, notably Acadian fizzled out in terms of performance more as the split went on. Not to say he was outright bad, but he was not carrying as hard or having such adequate performances in comparison to where he was. And a sports psychologist can fix these issues. It could have meant the difference of being in playoffs at all for Echo Fox. One could debate that. But the infrastructure is essential. We look at this as just one example of what it might have been like had the appropriate support staff been there to assist this team in making sure it focuses on the goals that it needs to focus, to diminish like Keith's worry about the community and have him zone in solely on his performance. which ironically, if he would have done that and performed a lot better, the community would have far less criticism, which means he would have had a lot less to stress out about. So it's funny how those things intertwine, but if it was something that he was that aware of, I think it could have helped him out. If they had the staff for it, it probably would have been much better. Second to last, player types and economic distribution. So you consider a team like KT Rolster, and despite having a star-studded lineup, they're the third place team. They finished the regular season in LCK, spring 2017, in third place, below Samsung Galaxy and SKT. SKT first place, Samsung Galaxy second place. Both of those teams had a better record and arguably better performance for the entirety of the split. So you might question why. When you think of player types, you think Smeb is a carry, you know that Deft is a carry, Score traditionally was a carry for the old KT Rolster lineup, 2016 and I believe 2015 as well. And notably, if you have three carries on the team, the economic distribution is going to be difficult. There are going to be some games where Deft might have to play a utility AD carry, which he doesn't seem to have a problem with, but his efficiency is probably greater on that of a traditional carry. Likewise, Score might play a more gank-heavy, CC-heavy jungler. You might think that in a game here and there he'll have to play Elise as opposed to playing Lee Sin or Graves, which would be fair if there's this trade-off that everybody gets this turn to carry. But because of this, you have to consider player types and economic distribution, and what's even better is that this intertwines with meta. In other words, if the meta does not favor, say, tank tops, and then it doesn't really specifically favor maybe utility AD carries or utility junglers or tank junglers, you have this problem where you can have three carries in these particular roles, but then the economic distribution won't match that, which means somebody will not be as relevant or as powerful as they could be were the team composition, a little more balanced with a tank somewhere in there, with a low econ role somewhere around there. So when you consider these types of things, despite the star-studded lineup, they could have performed a lot better, but there's this identity crisis, right? Because you have these individual players who are used to being carries. They come from long backgrounds, long reputations of being excellent at their lanes. Smeb, obviously, MVP twice in the LCK, even over Faker. And you think of these accomplishments, and that you must wonder to some extent, not necessarily player ego, but the confidence that they have in their ability to carry and how that might bump with one another, how they might not want to play second fiddle to the other carry. And this is where things can get tricky because team identity becomes an issue. And like I said, they finished third place. You have Samsung Galaxy, which was together. SKT made a few roster changes, but overall, SKT still manages to finish high in the ranking. As Samsung Galaxy makes one change, and they're still high in the ranking as well. It took them, admittedly, a little bit of time to find their actual optimal performance, which I hope to see in the playoffs as well, but they made it. They found their identity, and they worked towards it, and they got there faster than KT Rolster has so far. Now, KT Rolster is experimenting right now, so hopefully we'll see a better rendition of them, but not to get too sidetracked. The last and final thing, which really only applies to the beginning of the spring split of 2017, but I want to mention it because it's still relevant in terms of draft, and it was the changes to pick ban. A lot of people truly undervalued what that meant, because when you think of all of the metrics I've already mentioned, such as player types, and then you think of meta, pick and ban changes are immense, because if you have 10 bans altogether, 5 per team now, the way that you can choke out individual players on weaker teams is insane. Or even if a team has one star player, one name that is incredibly known, one name that can hyper carry, all the bans that you could place towards them, granted you'd probably be giving up some OP picks, but you could really neutralize a player, especially if they have an ineffective champion pool, a very small or narrow champion pool. And that wasn't really considered or talked about at the start of the spring, and I'm not going to harp on it now, but how it plays generally into the draft in the future is the teams that have the bigger adaptation to the meta and to the draft will understand how to pressure and pinch the champ pool in order to gain themselves the biggest advantage. If you're on blue side, you could easily ban out a few OPs, leave one open, try to get it, or maybe make a trade that you're willing to make since you have the first pick. Or if you're on the red side, you could pinch things down to 3 OPs, force the enemy to pick one, and then grab yourself 2 and still come out the victor in that pick ban. So some teams can abuse this a lot more efficiently than others, and this is going to mean quite a lot. Ultimately, what I want to look at here as a good example is I remember a draft that CLG had against TSM in which I believe their entire composition was physical damage, but I believe it was like Poppy, Graves, Jace, Obviously an ADC, and I don't really remember who the support was, but it wasn't. I don't believe it was like a bursty mage. It wasn't like a Zyra or anything. And since it was this physical damage, you wanted to get this early lead, and CLG failed to do that against TSM, who I believe had Maokai. Don't quote me on it. I don't really remember offhand, but they definitely had a tankier top, and they just scaled into it. Got themselves the early advantage, ironically, when they should not have, and then scaled through with armor. And there were plenty of mistakes that CLG made through the game, but I think that the draft was suboptimal in and of itself. So it's just important to note these things. Because obviously a good coach will take advantage of the pick and ban and then squeeze their advantages out before the game even begins. So now what does this all mean? I've listed these metrics just to run through them again, give you a good idea. Excuse me. We have the meta, communication and language barriers, team synergy and shot calling, infrastructure, player types and economic distribution, pick and ban changes, aka draft in this case. When highlighting these metrics, these are the things to assess team strengths going into a split. Now, obviously, if we're going into summer of 2017, expectations might be a little different for certain teams, as we've already seen them perform. There might be some roster shuffles in respective regions. I myself, I watch NA most frequently, EU and LCK kind of equally. And you look at roster changes, you look at all of these different factors, how the meta is shifting, and then you can generally see how a team should perform in theory based on their most recent performances, their most recent split, the reputation of individual players, how long they've had to practice, etc., these things that I've listed. And I just think these are the metrics to emphasize, these core variables that have to be accounted for whenever you're making a prediction or some sort of tier list or power ranking, whether it be ESPN or the Score Esports. These are essential. There are smaller factors that you can definitely apply, and I wouldn't ridicule anyone for doing so, because the wider your scope, the better your analysis should be if you have multiple metrics in which you can measure a team and their ability to perform. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I would just like to see, I guess, some more consistent rubric, although obviously some points are more valued. Like I said, it could be a little subjective from analyst to journalist, whomever, but there should be some sort of core metric, and I do believe that these are the necessary components or points.